From Proverbs 25, 6 and 7. Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence, or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. From Luke 14, 1 through 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. Just then, in front of him, there was a man who had dropsy, and Jesus asked the lawyers and the Pharisees, is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not? But they were silent. So Jesus took him and healed him and sent him away. Then he said to them, if one of you has a child or an ox that has fallen into a well, will you not immediately pull it out on a Sabbath day? And they could not reply to this. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who has invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go sit at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous.
All right, those two texts, the one from Proverbs and one from Luke, are our lectionary texts for today. This painting is a likeness of the Luke story. It's a picture of Jesus healing the man with dropsy. Dropsy, by the way, is a abnormal retention of water, sometimes thought to be or can be due to a kind of a heart disease problem. Around Jesus there are the Pharisees and lawyers, because the story takes place at the home of a Pharisee. They had invited Jesus to come for a meal, and then Jesus asked them, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And if you were here last week, we talked about one of the many cases where Jesus healed people on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees took exception to that. They considered that work, and they following the law, the Ten Commandments, thought you shouldn't work on the Sabbath. Jesus constantly, though, pushes back at that idea, claiming in this story, he says, if one of you loses an ox or a sheep down in a hole or in a well, wouldn't you pull it out? So there's the likeness of that in this icon, this painting of somebody pulling out their animal on the Sabbath, but they often complained about Jesus caring for people on the Sabbath. So you could say they were more concerned with their livestock than they were with one another, with their people. And that caused quite a dispute among Jesus and the Pharisees. The people kind of liked that, I think. And I mean, if you were the person with dropsy, I think you'd be kind of happy about being healed on the Sabbath. The title I've chosen for today, Solidarity and Enmity. Enmity means hostility. It's a real common word, but is a phrase used by a writer, Paul Dumichel, in his book, The Barren Sacrifice. So I've borrowed the phrase from Paul for this lesson today. Last week we talked about Jesus healing a woman who had been crippled or bent over for some 18 years, also on the Sabbath. In that story, the Pharisees questioned him about it. They didn't like that idea, and we looked at it in the context of because Jesus said that it was a spiritual condition that she had, and he attributed it to Satan. We recognize that the word Satan, I don't know that I expressed it this way last week, but the word Satan is not a proper noun. I mean, it means the accuser. We've personalized it, but it means accusation. So what I proposed was that this woman was crippled over under the weight of accusation from her community. And these Pharisees and religious leaders could have themselves removed that weight of accusation from her all these 18 years. They said, "Oh, we've got 6 days of the week you could heal people." Well, why hadn't they healed her in 6 days of the week for 18 years? I think it was because they needed her like we need people like the town drunk. We need people to see ourselves over and against as better than others. If we take away the people that we feel better than, how do we know how to feel about ourselves? We lose this pecking order that we have. But the great thing about Jesus is he gives us our identity. He says we are loved by him, by God. We are completely and totally loved, just like we are, by God. Meaning, we don't have to look for that affirmation anywhere else. We get it from God. And all kinds of problems ensue when you go seeking your identity in what other people think about you, because then you will inevitably become a manipulator of people to get them to think well of you. And it gets even worse when they're trying to manipulate you to get you to feel good about them, too. It's this vicious circle of manipulation that many people live their entire lives in. Jesus came to free us from that, to free us from the idea that we have to go seeking affirmation from other people, because if you're already affirmed by the creator of the universe, should that not be enough? That's a pretty good big deal, I think. So this time, the Pharisees didn't jump in and condemn Jesus. Jesus asked them, "Is it legal to heal on the Sabbath?" They gave him no answer this time. So I think at this point, the crowds are kind of swinging over to Jesus' side. And it was making it a little difficult for the Pharisees to keep pushing back on Jesus, because numerous times prior to this, they'd had these confrontations. So Jesus heals the man with dropsy, and then he tells two parables that are often conflated into one. I think it's important that we see them, though, as two separate but related parables. Before we get into the parables, let's talk about some cultural context. And 2 weeks ago, we used this illustration to describe how the nation of Israel at the time, and many other nations, saw themselves, constructed their societies. At the center of the society, and this holds true very much today, is the family. And there are obligations of solidarity and hostility, or enmity, at each of these levels. So let's talk about solidarity first. Family solidarity. We still have it today. Like, you would probably do things for members of your own family that you might not do for members of somebody else's family, right? So that indicates that you have a particular solidarity with your own family. The saying, blood is thicker than water, derives from that, right? We just naturally feel a solidarity with our own family. Now, I don't know that it's natural or not, but we do. And members of your family probably feel comfortable asking more of other family members than they would of non-family members. For example, if you're old enough to have adult children and they just show up on your doorstep at dinner time, you're probably going to invite them in and make room for them at the table and make them feel welcome. Where if it was somebody from somebody else's family that just showed up at dinner time, you might not be as welcoming to them. Most of our adult children just feel at liberty to drop by, and we'll include them. Clans in Israel were typically several families that lived in close proximity to one another. So they would assist each other, these families, at harvest time. If they had to build a building, they'd come together and assist each other building a building, very much like it was back in the 1800s and 1900s in frontier America. We talk about barn raisings, where groups of families that lived in close proximity to one another would assist each other, and those became those are like clans, like in the first century. You might extend a bit more solidarity to members of your clan than you would to your tribe or to your nation, because you have this working relationship with this group of people that probably lived nearby. Tribes are larger groups than clans. At this time in Israel's history, Benjamin and Judah were the two remaining tribes from the southern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah. And tribes have certain solidarities. Often it's ethnic or religious in nature. Tribes often would celebrate on special days, calendar days. This, at the tribal level, is, I think, the level Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan about. Because the Samaritans see, even though the Jews treated them as total outsiders, they were children of Israel too. The Samaritans were the descendants of the northern kingdom of Israel. When Israel split into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, the Samaritans came from, Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom. So we have the situation where even though the Jews of Jesus' day were very acrimonious toward the Samaritans, they were all children of Abraham. They were all of one tribe, even though they separated into two different tribes, if you will. We have tribes today. Our denominations could be considered tribes, our different Christian denominations. Our political parties could be considered tribes. Our ethnic identities could be considered tribes. We all live in the same nation, but we divide ourselves by these subgroups, tribal subgroups. And then at the top level, nations expect solidarity of their citizens, of course. Citizens that don't act in solidarity are often branded as unpatriotic. Like if you're a citizen of the United States and you don't do the expected behaviors of citizens of the United States, somebody is going to call you unpatriotic. If you don't take your hat off during the playing of the national anthem, you'd find out how unacceptable that is, right? There's great peer pressure to demonstrate solidarity at the national level. We had a good example of this just this past Friday night. If you watch football, Colin Kaepernick, who was the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, sat during the playing of the national anthem before their game with Green Bay. He sat in protest, saying he would not honor a song nor show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color. Well, the reaction, as you can imagine, was swift and divided. Some people agreed with him, stood up for him. Other people were viscerally opposed to him not showing the expected respect at a professional football game like that. So that's just to say, wherever you stand on that, it's just to say that when you stand back and you observe what he did and the response, that response was a solidarity response. It was expecting him to come into solidarity with his nation, regardless of what he thought about his nation, basically, right? So, okay, those are solidarity topics. As we think about family, clan, tribe, and nation, we can see how we all form solidarity. We form an affinity with each other in each of those groups, at each of these different levels that we exist in. We also, at each of those levels, there is expected hostility or enmity. It's not just that you're expected to be for your group, it's that you're expected to be against other groups. Just as solidarity was expected at each level, enmity is also expected. So by constructing society around group solidarity, group enmity toward those outside is also expected. So your solidarity obligation to your family would require an exceptional level of hospitality toward members of your own family. If you looked at how hospitable you are, and you'd say, well, how hospitable am I to people in my clan or my nation? And then you looked at how hospitable you were to your own family, you'd say, well, that's an exceptional level of hospitality that you show to your family in comparison to what you'd show from somebody, from another clan, tribe, or nation, perhaps, unless you're a really hospitable person. And that's what we ought to be. We all ought to be really hospitable persons. That's kind of what the stories that Jesus told today are about. But he was pushing against this. Enmity often arose between families. And in the first century, and between clans. We even talk about like the Hatfields and McCoys down in West Virginia, right? That was families and clans that were at enmity with one another. Clans provided a beneficial solidarity, but clans also sometimes banded together against other clans. You know, we love to define ourselves against other groups. Like at Jesus' time, disputes might arise over grazing ground for their sheep or water rights. And when disputes arose, enmity toward other clans was not just a byproduct, it was expected, because that enmity towards somebody else was how you gathered unity in your own clan. Tribes provided beneficial relationships, but these were realized in opposition to other tribes. Like the Jews got their identity over and against the Samaritans. You know, they saw themselves as much better than the Samaritans. The Samaritans thought they were better than the Jews. So how did they do that? Well, they set up this order, right? You know, we're better than you are. So even though the Jews had a beneficial solidarity amongst themselves, they also had a hostility toward other tribes. And at the national level, of course, there's enmity between nations. Jesus in the Olivet Discourse even prophesies that as happening later in the first century. He said, nation will rise against nation. What is that? It's enmity between nations. It's hostility between nations. Anyone who betrays the solidarity toward his own nation is considered a traitor. And that's considered one of the worst crimes possible. Why? Because traitors are considered, because traitors have violated the sacred solidarity of their own nation by expressing enmity toward their own nation. So being a traitor throughout history has been a very serious crime. So we see that there are solidarity expectations in families, clans, tribes, and nations. There are also hostility expectations in all four of those subdivisions as well. And then to add a little bit more to this punch, there are black sheep, what I'd call black sheep. So within each family, within each clan, within each tribe, and in each nation, there are people that we might consider black sheep. In other words, there are people that are not outside our family, clan, tribe, or nation. They're within it, but they're not members in good standing. You might have some in your family. You might have somebody that your family refers to as a black sheep. You still say they're part of your family. Like you don't kick them out of the family. They may make Thanksgiving dinner uncomfortable or something like that, but they're still part of your group, right? You're still part of that. It's usually people that are different in some way, but not so different as to be banished from the family, clan, tribe, or nation. For the Jews, the black sheep were people like the blind, the lame, the poor, the sick, the demon-possessed. All these people, they would say, yes, they're still Jews, but they're not Jews in good standing. They were typically not afforded access to the temple, which meant they couldn't bring sacrifice to get their relationship with God sorted out. So even though they still were Jews and they were members of the Jewish society, they were not members in good standing. They were considered to be under God's curse, that if you were sick or halt or lame, demon-possessed, you assumed that you were that way because God made you that way. Jesus comes and really pushes back on that. So every time he heals somebody from one of these groups, these black sheep groups, he's throwing their whole cultural identity up in the air, up for grabs. We've talked a lot recently about how these black sheep served a purpose. The reason they kept them around was because they were convenient to help the people that were not sick, that were not crippled, that were not demon-possessed, to feel better about themselves and to see themselves as over and against those other people. We've talked about this in the story of the man of the Gadarenes, who had been the scapegoat of his own community. The bent-over woman in Luke 13 that we talked about last week, she was oppressed by the accusation of the satanic voices in her community. So these were all people that still were within their community, but they were outcasts in a certain sense. So today in Luke 14, at the home of a prominent Pharisee on the Sabbath again, the Pharisees, it says, were watching Jesus closely. You can understand why. Because he was attacking these very fundamental structures of their society whenever he showed mercy toward one of their black sheep. This time, though, the Pharisees don't say anything. Jesus questions them before he even, like in the last two times, he heals somebody and then they object. This time, he kind of knows their game now. So he asks them before he heals the man with the dropsy, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? They don't give him any response. And then Jesus tells these two parables. And the first one I'll call a parable of reciprocity, and it's illustrated in verses 7 through 11. And I'll read it again to get it in our mind. Now, reciprocity means you give to get. Right? You do something with an expectation of getting something back. That's what reciprocity means. So the little icon here shows give, receive. It's kind of this circle of expectation. So I'll read this first parable. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So this is a parable of reciprocity. You could also think of it as a pragmatic parable. Anyone who wants to get ahead in life could understand this parable as good, solid advice. Right? You're not going to embarrass yourself if you follow this advice. So it's a pragmatic story. Jesus is offering the listeners some good advice, if you will. You don't want to be disgraced by putting yourself forward, only to be asked to move down the social ladder of recognition. This is all getting to what we've been talking about. The black sheep are on the lowest rung of the social ladder within the particular family, tribe, clan, or nation, right? And Jesus is getting at this here when he starts talking about this pecking order of recognition. In society, everybody wants to be recognized at important events like wedding banquets. We still do it today. We set up a head table for the honored guests at wedding banquets, don't we? So this would be like, don't go go through the food line and go set up next to the bride and groom at the head table if you're not in the wedding party, right? Because you're going to get asked to move to one of the other tables if that happens. So I think this is good, solid advice about how to be thought well of members in your family, your clan, your tribe, or your nation. Behaving honorably, like Jesus describes in this parable, would have led to more invitations to other social events. There was a reciprocity that was expected and sought. We still live this way. We invite people to our parties, and then there's sort of an expectation that they'll invite you to their party when they have another party, right? Our text from Proverbs says almost the same thing. It's Proverbs 25, 6 and 7, and this is Solomon, the King Solomon's writing. Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence, or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. So Jesus almost takes that story from Solomon in Proverbs and recontextualizes it to this wedding, to this banquet that he's invited to. So we might call this parable, the first one, the wisdom of Solomon parable, because Jesus adopts and proposes and teaches this almost word for word what Solomon taught. It's a parable of giving with an expectation of receiving something in return. There's nothing wrong with this. We do it all the time, right? Jesus even mentions whatever you sow, you will also reap. So it's not that Jesus is saying this is a bad thing to do. He's saying he's teaching it. This is one of his parables, so I don't think we ought to get down on it too much. But the next parable introduces something more than this. In verses 12 through 14, we read this. Jesus said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." So I've called this parable number 2 a parable of gratuitous generosity. Gratuitous generosity. Gratuitous means uncalled for, or lacking good reason, or done without expectation of something in return. Sometimes gratuitous is used in a more negative fashion. I want to use it in a positive fashion today. A parable of gratuitous generosity. Jesus is teaching that if you invite people that can't give you anything in return, that's what he's getting at here. So this is something more than the previous parable. The previous parable was actually the opposite kind of thinking. Give so that you can expect something in return. This one saying, pick out the people that can't give you anything in return and invite them. There's no societal or economic reciprocity sought or expected in parable number 2. Is there? There's no, you don't see anything other than the very last line where Jesus says you'll be repaid later, basically in heaven, at the coming of the Son of Man. So it's more of an investment than an expectation of return, right? Because you're not going to get it in this life, is what he's saying. And these poor, crippled, lame, and blind that Jesus is counseling them to invite were the black sheep. He's asking them to invite the people that they have identified themselves as better than and over against. So not only could they not repay you, inviting the black sheep meant that you were identifying yourself with them instead of with the other white sheep. That was a very, very countercultural thing to do. It still is a very countercultural thing to do. So while we might call the first parable the wisdom of Solomon, this one goes beyond Solomon's wisdom, and we might call it the wisdom of Christ. So we have these two parables, the wisdom of Solomon, which was a parable of reciprocity, giving in order to receive. The second one, which I'll call the wisdom of Christ because it goes beyond, but I don't think it supersedes the other one. It just is another way to think about things, and we'll get into that. I don't want to actually play one against the other, because Jesus taught them both. He taught them both as something good. But the second one has more weighty implications. It's more difficult to do. So one thing that helps, I think, is to pay attention to who Jesus addressed these two parables to, because they're not to the same audience. The first was addressed to people who are invited to a wedding banquet, or the guests. So the parable of reciprocity, Jesus spoke to the guests, and he counsels the guests to use the wisdom of Solomon, to use this kind of expectation of reciprocity. The second parable was addressed to the people who are inviting the guests, or the hosts. And Jesus counsels the hosts to use a different kind of wisdom, the wisdom of Christ. We call Solomon, the Bible actually refers to him as the most wise person to have lived prior to Jesus. I'll add that caveat. Because the text, when the Bible refers to Solomon as the wisest person to have lived, that's Old Testament text. That was before Christ came. So Christ has a wisdom that exceeds that of Solomon. And so when we read these two parables, I think it's important to us to pay attention to who is he speaking to in each parable. So in the first parable, he's talking to the people who are invited. In the second parable, the wisdom of Christ is to the hosts of the parable. Hosts of the banquet, rather. The wisdom of Solomon or in the first parable, allows the enmity toward outsiders and black sheep to remain. Right? Because remember in the first parable, he just says, don't go seat yourself at a too high a station. Allow your host to call you up. Does that parable do anything for the blind, lame, the crippled? It doesn't even talk about them, does it? So it allows that the wisdom of Solomon then allows our inbred, our assumed hostilities and enmities toward other people to remain in place, because it doesn't address them at all. It doesn't even speak to that issue. But the second parable, where Jesus includes all of those people, flies right in the face of that enmity and that hostility. It does away with the enmity toward outsiders and black sheep. Now, I'll point out one other thing. Jesus doesn't counsel in these parables to go crash somebody else's party, bringing the outsiders with you. He doesn't say to somebody that's invited, like if Dale's invited to the party, he doesn't tell Dale to go find blind, crippled, and lame people and drag them in and crash the party with them. So there's a certain order in these two parables. Jesus is not counseling us to try to force this reduction of enmity and hostility on our hosts. He's wanting us to be a good guest. So when you're invited, the wisdom of Solomon is what you should apply to your situation. When you're doing the inviting, consider the wisdom of Christ. Consider including some people that have no way to repay you. Consider including some people that maybe some of your friends would look down upon. But invite your friends too. He actually says in there, don't even invite your friends and your family. Go out and just invite these other people. Now, this was an honor and shame culture. We don't have many of those today, although Japan is one of them, China is one of them. There's places where we don't really have an honor and shame society in the United States. Honor killings, you hear about those still in some of the Arabic nations, where if a son or a daughter does something to bring shame upon the family, some people feel like they should lose their life for that. So we just black sheep them. If somebody does something that dishonors us, we might distance ourselves from them, but we typically don't kill them for that. But this culture was an honor and shame culture. They were very concerned with giving due respect for people at their various stages in the pecking order. An author named Emerson Powery writes about this honor-shame culture of the first century, and I'll read a couple paragraphs from him. In an honor and shame culture, avoiding shame is of the utmost importance. This is not simply embarrassment. Public shame may have tangible implications for the shamed. A family's bartering practices or marriage proposals can be negatively affected by a public shaming if the shame is significant enough. Jesus' words are a challenge to the honor system embedded in first century culture. To secure one's place in this system, it was appropriate to invite friends, family, and rich neighbors. Reciprocal requests would ensue, as the public acknowledgement of an honorable person may bring its own rewards. But Jesus calls into question this type of caste system. Emerson actually calls it a caste system. We think of caste systems in India. He's saying they had their own caste system there, and we have our own kind of caste systems in the United States, even though it's not really an honor and shame culture. But Jesus calls into question this type of caste system, imagining instead hosts who choose to associate with people who are poor, crippled, lame, and blind as their new network. The problem for hosts, however, as Jesus explicitly recognizes, is that no honor is forthcoming in return. You don't get the reward of honor when you invite people who the society considers shameful. Rather, he says, it's an investment in the future. kind of like a retirement account that you don't get access to until after you die. So the second parable also contains this promise of reciprocity, but it's not in this life. There is a reciprocity, but it's God repaying us. We don't even look to the people we invite to the banquet that can't pay. It's a reward that God provides to us in the next life. So I think I'll stop there. That went longer than I thought. I only had about 9 or 10 slides today, and usually it's an indication that it'll be short, but I guess I just ran on. Here's just some things to think about. How can we widen our gratuitous generosity to those outside our family, clan, tribe, or nation? You know, what can we do proactively to do that? That's one idea. How does inviting those who society considers black sheep help them? And how does it help us? I think there's a reciprocity in the invitation, if we'll do it, in the fellowship with one another. So that's another thought. And one other thing, in Matthew 25, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, toward the end of that, Jesus says, "Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink?" You remember this parable, Jesus is saying, give a drink, invite somebody, and when you do that, you're doing it to me. So I'll read that again. "Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" And the king will answer and say to them, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me." So here's the question. Isn't Jesus saying that in caring for the least of these, you're actually caring for him? In meeting the needs of the least, aren't we also meeting the needs of Jesus? If you can think about Jesus having needs, I mean, we say theologically that God is complete within himself, but Jesus seems to say in this sheep and goats parable that there's something beneficial to him when we care for those that can't care for themselves. Or as Scott McKnight puts it, in the act of giving to the poor, one meets God as God wants to be met in the world. Say that again. In the act of giving to the poor, one meets God as God wants to be met in the world. I mean, I'd be rich if I had a nickel for every time over my 60 years somebody came and asked me about how can I get to hear God? How can I get to feel closer to God? How can I get my relationship with God like all these people tell me? Here's how. You take care of the least of these, and you meet God in them.